Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and today we're going to talk about the Kabbalah. Kabbalah's been very much into the news, mainly because Madonna, the superstar, is studying Kabbalah, so people have heard it. What's she into? She's so famous, she has everything in the world. What is she looking for in the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism? Well, this is what we're going to delve into. I mean, it's more important just than because Madonna's looking into it, but it gives it popularity, and Kabbalah is getting very, very popular, like I said, with the movie stars and a lot of people around the world, Jewish and non-Jewish. So we're going to have to look into it. Obviously, a brief time to talk about it, so we're just going to give a general course outline of what the Kabbalah really is. But, hopefully it'll wet your tongue, and, maybe we can always discuss more in the future. What is the word Kabbalah? Actually, people say, all right, hyphen, Jewish mysticism. Really, it's very interesting. Kabbalah is from the word kabel in Hebrew, which means to receive, to accept, meaning that this is different than legalistic Judaism. Legalistic Judaism is rational, that everything is based on law, just like, you have civil law today, say, well, this case, it makes sense. A person punches someone in the nose, obviously it makes sense that you have to compensate them for the hurt, for the medical bills, etc. And you say, yeah, I understand that, I get that. So hopefully every civil law, you should be able to understand it, whether you like it or not. You don't wear a seatbelt, oh, we're going to give you a ticket, but you understand it's based on rational ideas. Hey, we want you to keep safe, and we have statistics. If you don't wear your seatbelt, you're not going to be so safe. So, whether you like it or not, that's another issue. But bottom line, there's obviously good rationale for, all civil law, hopefully. Obviously you can disagree with it, and maybe it should be better, but, they don't just pie in the sky. Different with that is when you're dealing with mysticism. When we're going to talk about it, and we're going to say there's 10 spheros or 10 emanations in the world. Well, prove it to me. What's the logic in it? How do you know there's not 11, 12, 13, etc.? Well, it's hard. I cannot prove it to you, and that's exactly what Kabbalah means. It's received all the way back from the first man, Adam, down to Moses. It was handed down one generation after the other. And really, and that's where Kabbalah is, because you can't say, well, prove it to me. Prove to me that all these spiritual dimensions. Certain things we are going to give logic for. We'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about, well, where's your soul? Prove to me you have a soul. And yes, we can prove that to a person. So certain things will be logical, and certain things will be super rational, which we can't understand. And exactly like I said, where the Kabbalah comes from. Now, there were famous Kabbalists, and the major work was the Zohar. Zohar means literally brilliance in Hebrew. And that book was written about 2,000 years ago by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He lived in Israel 2,000 years ago. Now, actually, I just had this discussion with a few people. They said, well, wait a minute, Rabbi, you just contradicted yourself. If the main work was written 2,000 years ago, and you're saying it was given back all the way, I just said, from Moses, who lived 3,300 years ago, how do you say the Kabbalah started 3,300 years ago when you say the major book that we have today is only 2,000 years ago? So it's a good question, and I try to bring up, obviously on television, you can't ask questions, so I try to bring up questions that people already have asked me, and therefore I figure, well, these are good classic questions, and I want to address them to everybody, because many people would have maybe the same questions, and you can't ask me, obviously, through the television. But in any case, I want to bring up these discussions right up front. The answer, therefore, is that many of these ideas, like I say, this is where Kabbalah comes in, were oral traditions. You don't have to say hand down, someone gave you a history book. There's nothing to hand down. You just read a book, or you read an old text. I mean, there are texts 200-300 years ago, even more, that you can look up over here. So you don't say, I received it as a tradition. You just say, well, I read a book, so it's an old book, but I read the book myself. But something's oral, then, obviously you can't look up an oral idea. You have to hand it down from one teacher to another, to another, to another. You can't say, well, I learned it from someone 200 years ago. Well, no one lives that long. So you had to learn it someone in your lifetime, and they learned it in their lifetime. And the chain goes back further and further back on one hand, but it has to be handed down from one person to another with no historical background to it. I mean, you can't say, let's look it up and look at an archaeologist and look for a Rosetta Stone, which then you say, well, I have proof. I have a Rosetta Stone or whatever. I have a document. I have the Dead Sea Scrolls in my hand. So therefore, that would be real proof that literally nobody argues with those things. It's written down. Here it is. Read it for yourself. But oral, you can't do that. The only thing is that you have to accept, and that's what I'm saying, receive from one tradition to another. So that answered that really was oral all the way back in history, was finally written down, like I just said, about 2,000 years ago. Really the same reason, again, using the legalistic idea of the Talmud, which was also oral back all the way back to year one. But on the other hand, it was only written down about 2,000 years ago. And the reason why both answers are they finally wrote it down. Why don't you keep on giving it over orally? But if you know Jewish history, that was around the Roman persecution of 2,000 years ago. Romans, they lived in Israel. The destruction of the temple was 70 A.D., and obviously it wasn't just one destruction. It was a lot of troubles for the Jewish people. You can understand yourself if you want to learn something by heart. You have to be rested. You can't think, oh, someone's going to knock at the door and arrest you. So it was going to be a very terrible situation, very tough times. And therefore they said, we're going to lose these traditions unless we write it down. If you write it down, I mean, you have it. Even if you forgot something, you read a book, oh, let me look it up. Let's go to the library. Let's look it up. Well, it's there in writing, even if you forgot. A doctor forgot a prescription formula or whatever. Well, it's in the book. I'll just look it up. Even if you forgot, a big deal. I mean, you just could, like I say, have a reference book. If you learn something orally, oh, I don't remember it, and my teacher's not here anymore, now what do? You don't have it. So therefore, that's the reason to answer that, why they finally wrote it down a few thousand years ago. So therefore, you see the book, the Zohar, and it's very interesting to read. Like the libraries, I don't know if the library has it, but you can get copies in Judaic bookstores in English also. So therefore, that's important to know that the source is there. Like I say, you can teach everything in the few minutes that we're allotted here. Just going to tell you the resources that you can go to. Well, we just talked about the 10 spheros, about the 10 emanations that the world was created in. Now, it's very interesting, and that's what we're going to try to do, is bring it from the mystical down to the reality and fuse the two together and make an interrelationship. And that's going to be very important. What do we see with the number of 10? Well, we know we have 10 digits or fingers and thumbs on our hands. These are the tools, so to speak, that we work with the world. You can talk and you think, surely, but how do you do something? You don't do something with your stomach. How do you relate or work in the world, do anything? You write. Maybe you don't need all 10 fingers to write something, but you build, you write. Anything you do, you use your hands. For the most part, you don't use your feet, you don't use your stomach, you don't use your heart. Well, you use your hands. These are the tools that how you relate to the world or you work in the world. You use your fingers. Well, that's exactly the point. We see that the mystical and the physical are really a continuation of each other. Very, very important idea in Jewish mysticism, because you could say, well, let's go into a cave and just meditate and go out into the next world, leave the physical world, And this is very, very unique in Jewish mysticism now, that you have to actually relate the physical to the spiritual, excuse me, because the physical comes from the spiritual, therefore parallels, the physical world parallels the spiritual. Very, very important point, very, very something unique in the Jewish mysticism, and that's what we're doing now also. We're talking about spiritual ideas, but we're relating, you see how something very physical comes from the spiritual. So there's 10 fingers, that's how we relate to the world. How does God, who is infinite, relate to a finite world? Is through his 10 fingers. Well, obviously there's no fingers, but his 10 spheros, his 10 emanations. And those are, and a little chart here, I don't know if we can see it so well, but I'll just bring it up here. Hopefully we can see it. The top 3 are intellectual. As you see the top word intellectual. And I mean, there's Hebrew, but it is translated for us. I mean, Hebrew is very important. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge are the first 3. They are called, in a way, mothers. Why? What's a mother? A mother means she's a source of children, offspring. And that's exactly what your mind is supposed to be doing. You think about something so well, or meditate, or contemplate it so deeply, it will emanate into the 7 emotional, that's the next category, 7 emotions, meaning your emotions shouldn't just be wild and just unadulterated. They should be connected and emanate from your intellect. So that's very, very important. And those are right to left, the kindness, severity, strength, and the middle one is beauty. Now, very interesting, you see it's not in a linear line, one line. There's right, left, center, and right, and then left, and then in the middle is the center, which we see very interesting. Again, that even though these are spiritual emotions, they really relate to us in our bodies also. We have 3 parts of our brain, very, very interesting. And also we have the emotional. Now, it's very interesting. The kindness is on your right, severity is on your left, and the beauty is in the middle. So that's very important, because that's a reason, a deeper reason, why we prefer our right over our left, because the right is kindness, and we'd rather, just like it's like what you do is what you get, so to speak. So just like we said, the physical comes from the spiritual, so too the spiritual relates to us like the physical. So meaning what we do in the physical world is what we get back in a very spiritual way back to us also, meaning that if you deal with kindness in the world to other people, in turn you get kindness come back down to you. So therefore, that's what I'm saying, this interrelation is very, very important. Spiritual to physical, and then physical back up to spiritual over here, back and forth. Well, then it keeps on going, and we'll talk about that also very, very briefly. Again, I've been saying that so long, and it is absolutely true. We are dealing with something very intellectual and very deep and very complicated and very detailed, and we're giving just a very, very broad outline of this, what Kabbalah is. Now then it comes down, we know you're supposed to think of something. Obviously some people just act on emotion, or people just do things. The proper setup and system is that there should be the intellect, then there should be the emotion, as we just said, and then it should come down into action. Very, very important in mysticism, again, as we said before, that people, just meditate and feel spiritual, but from your spirituality and your intellect comes emotion. You're supposed to feel, and then you're supposed to actually come out and be very functional and carry out what you thought is right, you feel is right, and actually carry it out. So that's a very, very important idea. These are how the spiritual ideas relate to the physical. So vice versa, So that's how everything comes out. Then, I'm making everything very, very brief. Then we have the Aleph Bays, the letter Aleph, which very hard to show it. I don't have it that big, but let's look at the middle Hebrew letter right after beauty. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. But in any case, this is the Aleph, the third letter, the middle letter after the word beauty is an Aleph. Now, of course, that this is very, very deep also, another very deep concept, and that is that the Hebrew is not, you could say, well, it's another language. You could say, you know, there's Chinese, Italian, and there's Hebrew, of course, fine, it's a language. It's a valid language, they teach it even at universities, fine. It's a language like any other. But that's not the way mysticism looks at it. It's actually, it's called Lashon Kodesh, and that means the holy language. Why is it holy? It's a language, fine. You know, Italians speak Italian, Chinese speak Chinese, and Jewish people speak Hebrew, at least in Israel. So what's the big deal? What's so special? Why do you call it the holy language? And the reason is just that in the Hebrew is the tool of God. That he created the world through the Hebrew language. The Bible, everybody really admits to it, all historians, was originally written in Hebrew. It's obviously translated practically in, every language of the world. But on the other hand, originally it was written in Hebrew. Now, Hebrew is not just, okay, Jewish language was written in Hebrew. What else are they supposed to be writing in? Not going to be writing in English in Israel. They wrote in Hebrew, but that's what we're dealing with, the mystical idea here. Now, the Aleph is very, very important, and you can look at every letter, how beautiful it is, because there's very deep ideas in the letter Aleph. Now, the Aleph kind of looks like an X, if we showed it to you. A little bit, not exactly an X, but it looks like an X, and that's actually a very important idea. Because what is an X? You can imagine it yourself. There's higher points and lower points to it. So the higher points are the connection from God. This is the idea, the philosophy that you have to think about, and this is a major question. Many philosophers had this question. First of all, you have to believe in God, but let's say for granted we will believe in God. Well, and God is infinite. He's not finite. Maybe another, like ancient people believed in different idols, but, most people would think that God is higher than the world, to say the least, and he's more infinite. And of course, here we are in our own experience, and we know we're finite. Today is today. It's not yesterday. It's not tomorrow. But there's nothing to talk about. We all know that. We're here now. Right now I'm here. I'm not in Israel. I'm not in Russia. I can't be in two places at the same time. So, that's just obvious that I am who I am. I'm not somebody else. So I'm locked in who I am in this time, in this place. You move on in time, you move on in place. And we'll talk about reincarnation another time. We can move into one body to another, but not for right now. In any case, that we are here in a finite world. Now, how does God go from an infinite level, he created the world, from infinity to finite? This is a big question, and it's not our question, it's a question that goes back thousands of years, and I think people have this question. Well, this is where the Aleph comes in, that the Hebrew letters are the connection between the higher realms and the lower realms. And that's where the X come in. It's the connecting factor. That's the first letter of the Aleph base. So that when we talk about an Aleph, we're trying to connect God to the highest level to the lowest level. Now, it's very interesting, the 10 Commandments, again, we have to look back at the original Hebrew, starts off with an Aleph, because that is the connecting factor, and actually a mitzvah, which, people say, well, a lot of people will call it a good deed, but it's more than that, because, for example, eating kosher, you're not helping anybody out. What kind of good deed is that? There are good deeds. There's a lot of charity in Judaism. but it's not exclusive to good deeds. There's certain things that have nothing to do with any human beings. So your business, what I eat, what am I helping you or hurting you of what I eat. So there are kosher laws, for example, and there's a lot of other examples that have nothing to do with good deeds, and it doesn't mean good deeds in any case. Mitzvah means commandment. That, if you look at a translation, that's what it is. It's a mitzvah is a commandment from God, but on a mystical note, it's even deeper. It's from the Aramaic tzavta, which means connection. But every commandment, every mitzvah, you're being connected to the Almighty. Every time you do something good, that's our connecting point. So again, this is what we're trying to do. We get from God, who's the ultimate spiritual being, it comes down to the physical being, and then our job, and we said it before, is to go from the physical to the spiritual and interfuse them and interrelate them together. In one sense, that's really, obviously there's so much details to talk about and to learn about, but that's the focus point of everything. How to bring spirituality down to us and how to raise up our physical being to the spiritual world. So that's very, very important, and that's what we're talking about here. And the tools then, and we talked about the 10 spheros, and we're talking about the Aleph base, the Hebrew language. And actually, it's brought down a very Kabbalistic idea that God used the Hebrew letters to create the world. That the Bible talks about the creation story, and the creation story is something that is written in Hebrew, and it says, well, let's read it. Was it just, well, he went to his workshop and he made this? God spoke and the world came into being. Let there be light. Let there be heavens, whatever. All the 10 different statements. And these letters aren't just simple words. These, again, are the tools or the fusion in order to that the tunnel, that the pipeline, in order that God created the world through these Hebrew letters. So that's very, very important for us to know. And it's a very mystical idea how that's brought out also. So that's just a little bit of the secret of the Aleph base. Now that we want to talk about how somebody physical, get a little bit into this, some physical can affect something very spiritual world. Now I'm going to give you an example, and this is very interesting. That if someone is down here and you draw a straight line, I have a blackboard, but you can imagine it yourself, all right, you got a straight line, and it goes up, let's say to the sun, 92 million miles away. All right, you got a straight line. Now let's say you move it over, instead of a straight line, you move it over, let's see, even from the beginning, and you just move it over a 16th of an inch, even maybe even smaller. And you make a second line. Well, right at the bottom point, well, what's a 16th of an inch? They almost look like the same line. They're very close to each other. But since they're so far away, right now they're very close, like my two hands. So they're very, very close to each other. But if you continue those lines and you go up millions of miles, by the time, let's say they're 92 miles away, like we just said with the sun, now I don't have the arithmetic in front of me, but you can only imagine that they literally are being thousands of miles away. You take those two lines, and by the time you extend them up millions of miles, or maybe thousands, maybe even a million miles themselves, apart from each other. So what we have here is that even though we're in a very finite physical world, but if we make one move and we make one little effort to change and do something, even the smallest little effort has major, major ramifications. It's a very beautiful idea. Again, if you're dealing on a spiritual basis, if you're looking at something very spiritual. So that's very, very important over here to understand. So because that makes our connection from the physical to the spiritual world more exemplary, that we can just see that how much effect that we can have. So we've been talking about, just to review and just to get them, we've been talking about a lot of ideas. It's just that we're talking about how the spiritual comes down to the physical world. We talked about to the 10 spheros. We talked about it, how we can connect ourselves to the through the 10 spheros, through the Hebrew Aleph Bays, and finally through that, finally through many, many ways, through many contractions. Kabbalists would say that you have to contract this infinite light to come down to the physical. Ultimately, we come down to the physical world. Well, here we are. But in turn, that it's not the ultimate purpose of the world, that you go from the physical world, we go to the spiritual world, and we have to bounce that way up through the Torah and the mitzvos, by doing good deeds, by doing commandments, by connecting ourselves with God. That gives us that energy to go higher and higher. And even though, again, we just explained that, even though, well, how much, what are we doing? We're on such a small little basis here on a finite level compared to God who is infinite. How much ever can we extend? How much can you accomplish in this world? So very much we can have a big effect. And I'll just tell you, maybe we'll conclude with one Hasidic story that talks about spirituality. We're supposed to bring godliness to wherever we are. So how do you do that? I mean, it's a big undertaking. Here we are, we're walking in the woods, and you're supposed to make something spiritual. How do you make something spiritual when you're, in the woods? There's nothing to do. It says by just saying one sentence of something holy from the Torah, one blessing. So even though, again, you say, well, that's not too much, that's so little, but again, even doing something little and small, we just don't know the ramifications. We just don't understand this. And that's something that, again, I gave you an example from the two lines, parallel lines compared to a connected line, that on one hand, that it's so small, but who knows what ramifications, what kind of levels we are reaching. So we talked a little bit about the spiritual making the physical, and the physical making the spiritual. And next week we'll continue on to even bigger and deeper ideas, because we have to talk about the spiritual idea which people like doing about the female unit and the male-female unity, finding happiness in life through Kabbalah. So a little bit Madonna's trying to figure out how to get happy, even though she's got all the money and fame you do want, but she's still looking for satisfaction in her life. And then people are always interested in reincarnation and life after death. So we talked about many beautiful ideas, and there's still more to come. And thank you very much.